It is an honor to listen to an institution. My own background at IIM Ahmedabad, I had occasion to listen to him, first time at that time, and many occasions thereafter. And I continue to believe, despite his age, his mind is always at work, and it's always a pleasure to listen to his observations, sir. Thank you once again for taking the trouble to come from Chennai at a time where you're recovering from a bout of illness. It's an honor, and we are greatly honored by your presence here and your thoughts. I'd also like to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about Dr. Atin Roy. Dr. Roy is the Director and CEO of the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi. He has had postings in London, New York, Kathmandu, Brasilia, and Bangkok, and he has worked as an economic diplomat and policy advisor with UNDP, focusing on emerging economies. He's taught at the Universities of Manchester and London and served as economic advisor with the 13th Finance Commission. Dr. Roy is member, India Advisory Committee, United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, Inquiry into a Sustainable Financial System. He is a member of the Meta Council on Inclusive Growth, World Economic Forum, Geneva, and also member FRBM Review Committee, Government of India. Dr. Roy holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge. Welcome, sir, and thank you for your thoughts.
And thank you to the Bombay Chamber of Commerce and the Economic and Political Weekly for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here for three reasons. First is, of course, I'm from Bombay, and I continue to like, and I like to say this in Bombay, to see institutions that continue to use the word Bombay in their title. So that makes me very happy. I'm very happy to be associated with any event that EPW has, because in a sense I was conceived at EPW, because my parents worked there and met there. So there's a family relationship in a sense with EPW. And the third, of course, is that I didn't have to prepare for this lecture because I knew that Dr. Rangarajan was speaking before me. And you've heard his lucidity. My one regret in life, I have never regretted not doing an MBA, but I do, as you were saying, regret not having gone to IIM Ahmedabad, because I've never had a teacher quite like this. If you noticed, he was bang on time, and his canvas that he covered was not something I could possibly do justice to. So there's no point in my trying to write something ex ante. I thought I'd take on from him and then launch into the subject based on the touchstones that he has provided. Let me tell you my basic difference, which is strange since I'm a social democrat and I do believe in active government. My basic difference with, I think, most economists in this country with respect to how the government should react to the economy. I think with the government of India, we have a major problem in instrumentation. That is, that if the government of India says that it will do X, it does it badly, and therefore the productivity of what it does is very low. Until such time as that changes, I'm of the belief that in the long term, budgets should try as far as possible, except in case of grave exigency, to be modest and focus on reforming the business process of government. I'm very happy that, particularly since this government has come to power, that process has begun. And some sensible things have begun to happen within government, but I think there's a long way to go. Let me start by saying that one of the things that needs to go a long way is for the government to stop thinking in annual bursts of time. And in a sense, we're all complicit in this because we all wake up to the situation facing the Indian economy approximately a month and a half before the budget. This is not sane or rational for an emerging economy of, $3 trillion now. Some thought has to be applied as to the consequences of what we do in 2017 to where we will be in 2020. And I guess that's why the Prime Minister has tasked Niti Aayog with coming up with a vision to 2030 and a 7-year plan and a 3-year strategy. But in the absence of that, we will need to, I think, continue to be modest and what the finance ministry can and should do is begin, and is not doing, I can tell you that from the inside, is begin the process of, in the budget, of writing a 3-year medium-term fiscal framework. Now that has, interestingly, many political economy implications. One, of course, is the implication of the mind, and that I think is slowly changing. Even with GST, I've been telling people, you see, when you're a small, poor, third world country, then your political power comes from giving and withholding tax exemptions. So you would expect that part of the budget to be very large, as it was for most of my lifetime, when we were a small, poor, third world country, more or less aspirationally stuck at 3% till the early 90s. Then, as you emerge and become a middle-income country, the political heft you get from the budget, and this is very important, the budget is a political document. Governments have to win elections, state governments, central governments, comes from favoring some groups in society and not favoring others in terms of public expenditure. Now, I think we have come a long way there in terms of the fact that the Part A of the budget, the taxation proposal, sorry, I can't remember it's Part A or Part B, the taxation proposals, for the first time last year was smaller than the rest of the budget. And for the first time last year, only 10% of that talked about individual tax rates. It basically laid out a framework of taxation policy, and then the rest of it was on expenditure and on fiscal management, which is how it should be. So I think we have made progress there. I've used this argument in trying to convince state chief ministers about GST, saying that, especially rich states, saying that you're now a rich state, Maharashtra. I don't know how long the state will be rich the way things are going, but if you're a rich state, then your political power comes from giving Sangli more money and Nasik less money, not from giving some pan masala wala, a tax exemption this year and a pressure cooker wala next year. That is what countries with $700 per capita do, because there's nothing to spend. But now you have a sizable budget, and you can start working on expenditure. So in that political economy context, I think a medium-term expenditure framework is very important, both for disciplinary reasons and for reasons of political impact. Then this silly idea that if you spend money 1 year before an election, which has been proved wrong repeatedly, you're going to win that election, will go away. You have to spend money 3 years before an election to win the next election, because that impact takes time. And so I'm making a political point here to the politician. The biggest obstacle to this, I believe, is two things. One is the bureaucracy, and the second is us guys in the private sector, because we have got used to rent-seeking behavior, which is essentially short-term. Let me give you an example from tax policy. Tax policy in India is medieval in nature. Why do I say it is medieval? Because notice that when we talk about tax in this country, we say estimates. We don't say forecasts. Why do we not say forecasts? Because we don't have forecasts. Because what does the taxation department do? The taxation department, like in the times of the Mughals, the Peshwai and the British, are given targets to go out and collect taxes. And they have a set of instruments of negotiation and an army of chartered accountants to mediate this. Very similar to what was happening with Lagan, land revenue collection, intermediaries, and the state. That hasn't changed fundamentally, except you have an income tax service now, that's what it's called. But ultimately, they're collecting taxes that old way. Then if they don't meet targets, you all know what happens. And then pressure is put and targets are met. So we are running an effectively decrepit tax system, but people respond. And Dr. Nagarajan made that point. How do people respond? People respond by using their political power to then get exemptions, which then complicates the structure even further. And then we get into a culture where the soft drink industry will come and talk to me, not about tax, they do. But they'll come and say, budget mein, please make sure that Coca-Cola is not taxed as a sin. So industry is always doing this. Industry does not talk to the government. Just look at GST, about GST as a whole in a systematic, structured dialogue way and in a frank way. Industry talks in terms of individual exemptions. That culture has to change. For that culture to change, tax revenue forecasting, not estimating, must say what is my tax base. It's either income or consumption, sometimes assets. How is that likely to grow over the next 3 years? And on the basis of that growth and my taxation parameters, which are your tax rates and your efficiency collection, what is my likely tax revenue collection likely to be? It's not rocket science. We can do it at an IPFP in 6 months. But the government must want it. Regrettably, I have to report to you that the government does not seem to be interested in this on the revenue side. They seem to be very interested in this to their credit on the expenditure side. There's a parallel process that goes on the expenditure side. So in this budget, I am looking for these kinds of unglamorous but important reforms to raise the productivity of government expenditure so that I can do what my instincts tell me and argue for an active government. But until I see a government that is fit for purpose and is capable of spending money effectively without 70-80% leakages, my conscience will not allow me to argue for an expansionary government. For which reason, I would like to see this budget as limited as possible. Now, I did say with exigencies, but let me before that just come to the basic income point, because that is tied to the efficiency of government. As Dr. Rangarajan rightly said, universal basic income is universal. It is unaffordable, but it has one great merit. When it is universal, then how decrepit government is does not matter, except at the margin. You can have a third-rate government like we do, in terms of its operational efficiency, it's third-rate, right? But that third-rateness does not affect something if everybody can give it, as long as you have the instrumentation to do it. That instrumentation is not the banking system necessarily. I know there's a lot of attention paid to that. Let's assume that everything goes cashless and India is converted into one giant app, all right? So there's no problem getting money into someone's account. But the idea behind basic income is essentially that of a universal income tax, which is everybody has a PAN number, everybody. Some people pay into the system and some people get from the system net. Then the policy decision becomes how much net. So Rathin Roy also gets 1,000 rupees a month, but Rathin Roy pays tax on the basis of his income. So the net I get is whatever tax I pay minus 12,000. Somebody else pays no tax, so they get 12,000. Somebody else pays less than 12,000 a month tax, they get whatever, right? That's the idea of a basic income. If you cannot do it and you want to start targeting, then the same objections apply as apply today in terms of the ineffectiveness of targeting, etc. I mean, the fact that we had to actually ask people to voluntarily give up something tells you that there was government failure. Government cannot implement, even if it wants to, implement schemes to scale and effectiveness that they intend doing. For which additional reason I'm suspicious of basic income unless we are able to do it universally. So I'm looking forward to the budget. I know there will be a chapter on basic income in the economic survey, but I think we should be a little careful when we proceed. Now let us come to the exemption I made, that however decrepit a government has to respond in times of grave economic using fiscal policy and monetary policy. From the point of view of the private sector, there is certainly a grave economic exigency that I can see, which is that with pre-demonetization, that the private sector is not investing. What should government do about it? There are two answers. One is that the government should not bother about why the private sector is not investing and should invest instead of the private sector. That is what different terms are used for this. One term is, Ashima will not like what I'm going to say, counter-cyclical policy, but I ain't seen a business cycle in India yet. So I don't know what cycle we are in. I would like to see a cycle. A polynomial is not a cycle. I would like to see actually cyclical behavior, downturns, upturns, as one describes them in economies, but never mind. You may also want to say that when some agent is not doing enough, the government should step in as the agent of last resort. There are ideological and political issues with that. But let us assume that we agree with that. One, as Dr. Rangarajan pointed out, the central government does not do capital expenditure. So immediately I begin to wonder, if we must increase capital expenditure, then why not allow the states higher fiscal deficits instead of the center and let them do extra capital expenditure? They're anyway more fiscally prudent by and large. They're closer to the ground. So why should the center take on the onus of doing capital expenditure? Even if this is not accepted, I would ask, if the center is going to do capital expenditure, what is it going to spend on? What does the center do in terms of capital expenditure? When it comes to roads, ports, infrastructure, you know as well as I do, the center is a merchant bank. Earlier they did PPP, now they do leverage, they do 6x. NIIF put in 20,000 crores, leverage 5x. Again, because the state's ability to execute capital expenditure, the central government, is very low. We are maxed out on roads. Okay, airports, we have had to go to the private sector. Why? Because the execution capability of AAI is zero. So we have to wake up to this reality one day and not just pretend that throwing money into central government execution is going to work. So what, if it's not going to be infra, what will they invest in? They will either invest in defense, or what they will do is put equity into the public sector, right? Including Air India, and then hope like hell that the public sector will do investing by a mixture of carrot and stick. That seems to be a very unsatisfactory way in which to stimulate private investment. So even if the reason why private investment is not going up, we're not bothered about. Now, why is private investment not going up? There is one more angle there where the center may intervene, even accepting all my other arguments. That is not just to make up on the capex side. But if the private sector investment is not going up because there is deficient demand in the economy, then one could argue, especially if one were a Keynesian, that the center's job is to increase demand. So the center must spend more to increase demand. And there you can calibrate by saying the center must invest more. But I wouldn't buy it if there's a demand problem, where we might have a slight difference of view. Because if there's a demand problem, then the demand impact of public investment, especially in fixed capital formation, will take much longer than simply raising public consumption. So in that case, what we are basically arguing is that the demand problem, that the state should increase the amount of money in the pockets of households so that they can spend money and stimulate demand. How will the state do that? Essentially through more subsidies or direct income transfers. What will that mean for the fiscal deficit? It will mean nothing for the capital expenditure component. It will mean a further rise in the revenue deficit. Effectively, you will be borrowing to consume. The trouble with borrowing to consume, unlike most countries, the central government, the revenue deficit, you may disagree with the exact number, but I would say contains all of borrowing to consume plus something more, right? The revenue deficit is total current expenditure, the proportion of borrowing that is undertaken not for capital expenditure, for current expenditure, as defined currently. Revenue deficit as a proportion of the fiscal deficit was 4% in 1980-81, 18% in 1990-91, 36% in 2000-2001, and 72% last year, just fell to 68% in the latest budget. For the first time for the second or third time in 41 years. So 2/3 of your fiscal deficit, which follows from what Dr. Rangarajan said, if the central government is not a player in capital expenditure, it has been essentially borrowing to consume. You're going to add to that consumption expenditure in a situation where interest payments already consume half of your tax receipts. I don't think that's a very good idea. A better idea would be to do a Calder-Hicks, which is you tax people more, and then you transfer money to other people. But again, your taxation capacity is an issue. Because if you want to increase the tax-GDP ratio by 1%, the kind of punitive increase you will need to have in tax rates, plus taxpayer harassment, given the third-rate quality of our revenue system, raises the cost of doing so to a level where you have to wonder whether the benefits are worth it. This is yet another example of, I think, the vicious circle we are in. We have an ineffective government mechanism, and therefore, whenever we talk about expanding the state's role, we are thrown up against this wall of ineffectiveness. And I think that has gone on for too long, because the implications of that are 50% of our interest payments are going for taxes. I cannot grow my civil service. 88% of my government employees are not civil servants. They're either paramilitary personnel or soldiers. There are problems there. We have subsidies, but we have cut them, and if you cut them further, you would still not get away with the revenue deficit. So either on the demand side or on the supply side, I see very little merit in expanding the size of the central government's activities, whether for capital or current expenditure now. I could be persuaded that there is a case for the center to raise the volume of resources it sends to the states, and I would have so been persuaded if I had been persuaded of Uday. But I'm not persuaded of Uday from what I'm seeing on the ground. Uday isn't working either, in terms of the expected result from it, which is spend money, give the states a little more money, let them fix the DISCOMs. When the DISCOMs are fixed, we will be out of this ridiculous situation where we are power surplus on the production side, and people don't have electricity for 6 to 8 hours a day because of the DISCOMs, right? These are very real things that we must keep in mind when we talk about the budget. I'm a trained economist, and it would be very easy for me to retire to my comfortable world of, let's increase capital spending, or let's increase aggregate demand, stimulate, pump prime, counter-cyclical. I keep hearing these words. But these words are not part of the Indian reality, which is the government of India is both in a fiscally extremely perilous situation and is not very effective. It operates, for years it has operated in the present continuous tense. In Hindi, हम करेंगे, हम कर रहे हैं. But हम कर चुके हैं. Right? The past perfect is a very rare word in Indian public policy. The nice thing about the reforms of the last 3 years is I can very happily say that a number of things have happened. For instance, I can also affirm with Dr. Rangarajan that I think this year a fall in the corporate tax rate can be reasonably expected. And I'm almost certain, depending, except what you guys do at the last minute in North Block, I'm almost certain that that will be fully financed, at least in terms of the forecast, by tax exemptions. So there will not be any net cut in direct taxes. There will be a cut in the incidence of direct taxes, which will give you a cut in rates, right? On the GST, I can also say that I'm completely confident from my own calculations. I agree with Dr. Rangarajan. You will get 3.5% this year. Given the increase in indirect tax and tax revenues, take away what we did not get from spectrum, and take away what we did not get from disinvestment, but add to that a little bit more of RBI dividend, and the calculations are getting me to 3.4, 3.5% of GDP. So I think this year's record will be maintained. I have already said to you, irrespective of my participation in the FRBM, because remember that's a collective decision, that I think the government of India should think very carefully, in fact I'm being even more fundamentalist, about taxing people more or borrowing more to spend more. It has to think carefully about how it spends its money, the government of India, and it's not doing that. We have a far better situation, as I said, with the states. So, in terms of the overall macro-fiscal picture, I think what we will be setting ourselves against is a sound base at 3.5%, but still with a very high borrowing to consumption ratio. The next challenge will come in reducing that borrowing to consumption ratio. There are two mysteries here which the budget will not unpack and which we need to think about in the medium term. One mystery which you're better able to solve than us, and on which demonetization has a great impact, I'll close with that, is why is the private sector not investing? And now I'm confused, so I hope we come up with in the discussion with something. I was getting one narrative before the demonetization, that the private sector is not investing because banks are not lending and demand is not there, etc., etc., etc. Now I'm told that SMEs have collapsed because of demonetization, which means in the absence of demonetization, they were okay. Or has something incremental happened to the factors that were already extant before demonetization that are causing so much grief after demonetization? That is something we need to know. The second is a very simple thing. Auto sales tells me that. Let's get this straight. If people were operating outside the realm of the formal economy illegally and using that money to consume or invest, and if demonetization has, as you rightly say, not the future problem, has solved the historic problem or addressed it, you will get a fall in growth. If people were buying cars, engaging in illegal activity and they were buying Skodas, and if demonetization has worked, they will buy fewer Skodas. I don't see why the government didn't get this. It's very simple. One of the signs, in fact, of success of the black economy is a fall in the growth rate, right? Because it will slow down economic activity. People will have less money than they did to consume and invest. So you can't have it both ways. A reduction in black money will result in a reduction in your trend growth rate. Because there is a coefficient, there's a link between the amount of illegal money you earn and what you do with it. People buy houses, people buy cars, people construct stuff. All that will slow down. So this is one puzzle I have not got. The reason I'm saying that is if we do feel that demonetization is successful, then we should expect a drop in the growth rate and prepare for it in the medium term. If you feel that this is just a temporary measure, then I think we need to look at very temporary measures which do not include fiscal pump priming. Then we wear it out, right? For if it's an intra-year, 2-3 quarter problem with the growth rate. The second puzzle that we have, and then I'll conclude, for this budget, which comes again out of demonetization, is what precisely is the impact going to be on two things in the economy. One is of course, the growth rate, but the second also is the inflation rate. I have seen very little comment on what impact demonetization will have on the inflation rate, and this is very important for government. The chief statistician has done his job and has given government a 7.1% growth rate, to which if we add, as you were saying, 4.5, we are at 11.6, 11.7. But when growth falls, surely inflation should also fall, even allowing for the stickiness of food prices. And if growth and inflation both fall, then the nominal growth rate will fall by more than the 1.5% we're expecting next year. And then the government has a serious problem spending money. If you think it is temporary, then just to hold spending constant, I would not be too upset if the government put a pause on the fiscal deficit, right? If growth and inflation both fall. But then where are you if growth and inflation both fall? You are in a less heated, smaller economy, having extinguished some of the activities you did not want to happen, as a consequence of which you do not have growth, as a consequence of which you also have lower inflation. And then the government, basically to protect its own spending, not to increase it, raises the fiscal deficit. You hope that people then change their behaviors and invest in areas where you want them to invest. The one thing I think government was thinking about, which is where this basic income and Jan Dhan money is coming in, is that the government, and this is something that I've heard the Prime Minister say, it makes a lot of sense to me. This one statement of his makes a lot of sense. He says that if the country is going to grow at 8%, then we must be producing goods and services that poor people consume at 8%. So what are those goods and services we can go into? But that is clearly not the pattern of consumption now. In an economy where Bombay economists take auto sales as drivers of economic health, we are not in that sort of economy. We're not an economy that is producing stuff that 1 billion people consume. We are an economy that is producing stuff that you and I consume. So if he wants that shift, that's going to take time, and that will obviously be accompanied by lower growth rate, but it will also mean a change in the pattern of business and demand incidence in the economy. So in the budget, the way that would come is if there were Calder-Hicks transfers. That is, you took from the rich and gave to the poor, which is why this talk is there. And the extent to which the budget does do this will, I think, is the second big puzzle in the budget I'm looking forward to. To conclude, we have one final conundrum which I want to lay to rest, purely out of schadenfreude. Because I said this 3 days after the budget, and Dr. Rangarajan, I hope you'll agree with me. 3 days after the budget, a very senior political figure, very senior, came to me and said, Dr. Roy, your FRBM committee is now redundant because the government is soon going to have 2 lakh crores. So I said, how would you have it? And then Bombay helped me. Because all sorts of economists sitting in this city wrote like it was the easiest thing in the world, that, you have demonetized, and because you've demonetized, since all the notes will not come in, your currency liabilities will go down, and therefore you will transfer that to the government. I had said then, I say it now, we must get rid of this kind of lazy thinking. I mean, if somebody just takes the trouble, the former governors, you look at the RBI balance sheet, you will know that things are not so simple, and it put unnecessary pressure on the current governor. The RBI balance sheet sequesters currency liabilities because they do not carry an interest burden. You would first have to de-sequester it. You would then have to take a policy decision to change the RBI's dividend policy, and so on and so forth. Quite rightly, some people in government pointed out very quickly that this would not happen. But to the extent it did happen, there is one other puzzle, and even if it is 40, 50,000 crores, what can the RBI do with that money? One of the things the RBI could do probably is to recapitalize the banks. So one thing that you might see as part of the fiscal action that happens the next quarter is, I think, a more either recapitalize the banks, or you could follow the Prime Minister's instinct and try and see if you could, just like you demonetized, you could put money into people's accounts. So that's far more difficult. And there's a problem with it. So suppose you say you want to put money into Jan Dhan accounts, which is not basic income, but basic income light. Trouble is that even if you accept that only poor people have Jan Dhan accounts, it is not true that all poor people have Jan Dhan accounts. So since I'm a political economist, my political duty to point out to the government, you can lose votes this way. Because you may make 200 million or 300 million Jan Dhan walas very happy, but the 300 million don't have Jan Dhan are going to be very mad at you. So I don't know whether they'll go there, but there is that option. The other option, of course, is to try and recapitalize the banks using whatever windfall dividend the Reserve Bank has from these notes. Now, it is not the case that this has not been done in the past. I have found at least 2 cases. One, the German Bundesbank, at the time of the move from the Deutschmark to the euro. Because the Deutschmark was strong, they made a windfall gain. And that was transferred to the finance ministry, but through a lot of legislation. And the second was Israel, who also did it through a lot of legislation. So I think we should lay that ghost to rest now. That is not happening. There's going to be no windfall coming to government as easy as we thought. There might be some modest amount of money coming, which can then be used for some structural reforms. So to conclude, I think that demonetization poses one important challenge, which is, will the government take the call that the inevitable fall in the growth rate is temporary or less temporary? Less temporary meaning that people the economy was growing because of bad things. It will now grow because of good things. So will that process take more than a year, in which case we should be more modest about our growth forecasts. If it is temporary, then I do not think the government of India has the instrumentation to undertake countermeasures to boost the growth rate even temporarily, unless it increases consumption expenditure, for which the room is very limited. The room for the government of India to increase capex, as I pointed out to you, is both limited and undesirable. There are other places we can do it. So I'm hoping that the budget, I think against hope though, that the budget continues to be modest, that this government continue to husband its resources to be able to deliver sometime closer to the next election, and that the fact of demonetization and the perceived pain that it is causing does not lead the government to announce knee-jerk responses in the budget when the real problem is way beyond the remit of fiscal policy. Thank you.